Well, hey there. Welcome back to my public apology tour for writing off modern survival horror. Just like last time, I've rounded up a bunch of titles that I think fall into the general classification of Resident Evil clone. And once again, that's not some kind of a thinly veiled insult, but instead a rough approximation of games that chase the classic survival horror framework established and popularized by that collection of creepy hallways masquerading as a video game series. This time around, we might be a little more liberal with what exactly that means, but I assure you I've got an incredibly interesting lineup for you. Oh, and also, a few of the games we'll be covering today are on sale as we speak over at goodoldgames.com, so if you're looking to snag a great survival horror title at a discounted rate and help the channel out, I'll have some links in the description. And with that being said, let's dive in. What's up, guys? I'm Jared, and this is Avalanche Reviews. I figure a perfect way to start this thing off is with the game I think I may be in love with. Signalis is a top-down, voxel-based, maybe, survival horror title developed by Rose Engine, and the ties to Resident Evil may as well be neon lit in this game, which is fitting because it has a very dark cyberpunk sort of aesthetic to it. For me, I get a very Ergo Proxy by way of Dead Space kind of vibe, or if you want to get real nerdy, it looks like it was somehow created by Tsutomu Nihei. But I'll go ahead and warn you up front, this is not going to be a very long overview since the game is yet to come out and all we really have is this brief demo showing off some basic but very promising gameplay elements. Signalis is the story of Elster, who I think is some kind of a cyborg robot type of deal. She gets a signal waking her up and comes to find the ship she was on derelict in some snowy wasteland and the crew nowhere to be found. On the plus side though, she's not alone. Terrifying creatures that tread a very thin line between Lovecraft and Giger seem to be hanging out, so that's nice. And as far as story goes, that's all we really know. Now, there are a lot of hints at a much deeper cosmic horror kind of situation here, but the demo plays it real close to the vest, and I'm fine with that. Besides, if I had to guess, we're all here for the gameplay anyways, and that's good because this thing basically functions as a top-down survival horror game. You'll traverse the environment solving puzzles, collecting items, managing your limited inventory, and fighting or running from foes, which will all be familiar elements if you're watching this video, but you just never change your view from that nearly isometric perspective. Well, I guess that's not entirely true. There are these first-person sections where you can examine things up close to find clues, which, by the way, the artistry going on here is just on another level. Like I said before, these appear to be voxels, but my 32-bit brain still sees this as a pixel-based image being scaled and rotated as if it were 3D, which will always just impress me, and honestly that goes for everything I've seen in this demo. The art is just mouth-watering with this mix of traditional pixel art and well-animated voxels. There's even a cool CRT effect that I likely won't ever use, but looks pretty damn convincing. The overall aesthetic, if you can't see it yourself, is a mix of dark cyberpunk, goth, and that 80s and 90s retro future type of approach that saw even people from far beyond our timeline still using cathode ray tubes for displays, which is really awesome. Combat may take a quick second to get used to, but after that it's pretty boilerplate. You take aim with a shoulder button, fire with a different shoulder button, and use a kick while the enemy's on the ground to make sure they stay that way. You know, Silent Hill rules. From what I can tell in this short glimpse, it's poised to be an absolute game of the year for me. Every single screen is just dripping with personality, and it doesn't help that they're using a gameplay style that bypasses my conscious thought and hits me straight in the lizard brain. Now, this isn't a sponsored ad or anything, it's just that damn good. I played through this demo late at night with the lights off and my headphones on, and it felt like I'd been transported back to my early teens. It really replicates that mystery and dark curiosity you likely felt when playing your first classic RE game. Listen, if you're gonna take one piece of advice from me this decade, make it this. Go to Steam, download this demo, and try it for yourself. Then wishlist it and sit in front of your computer refreshing the screen till Signalis is released. If it makes you feel any better, that's exactly what I'm gonna do. Okay, so for this one, we're dealing with more of a clerical error than an actual entry in the list, and I know that sounds strange, but follow me on this one. The Medium was sold to me likely in the same way it was sold to you, as a game going after that classic survival horror standard. Not long after launch, I remember hearing a lot of rumblings about this thing being similar to Silent Hill, something that is interestingly both true and untrue at the same time. But regardless, I figured I would check it out. After all, I'm on a modern survival horror kick, why not grab what seems to be the largest budget title I've looked at so far? Oh, and by the way, right now this game's on sale over at goodoldgames.com with a pretty significant price cut, so if you want to check that out, check the link in the description. Well, I'm not going to hold you guys in suspense. This game is not survival horror. It does not attempt to clone Resident Evil or Silent Hill in any gameplay or design sense, so I guess the question is, why have it on the list? Well, I think there's enough raw material here to work with that I could at the very least draw a few similarities.
Cover your nose. Try not to look at him. The sooner we're done, the sooner we can get out of this place.
Definitely didn't need to feel that.
I started playing the Medium last week to get footage and almost immediately knew it was not fit for this video, but then something happened. I just kept playing it. I really got into its story and, more importantly, how it went about delivering it, so indulge me for a bit. I promise this is all going somewhere. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Medium's narrative a little bit, and then we'll cover what elements it shares with survival horror games, if there are any to cover, that is. And I'll tell you right off the bat, this game starts off with one hell of an emotional opening. Our main character, Marianne, has just lost her adopted father, a man that played a huge role in her life, and we take control of her as she dresses his body for the funeral. Through some inner monologue and scattered documents, we find out that our girl here has a few standout features to her character that might come up in a job interview. First off, she suffered intense burns across a large portion of her body at a young age. Second, she was a foster kid and bounced back and forth between families until she met the father figure she's getting ready to bury today. And third, a slight addendum here, she might have the ability to see into the other side.
No wonder people used to think I was strange. If they only knew.
She can speak with spirits and interact with the afterlife, and this comes with quite a few related abilities. After being forced into a situation where she has to help her own father figure pass on to the other side, she's contacted by someone who seems to know what she can do and needs her help. He doesn't give much more info than that, and then the call gets cut off, and that's our inciting incident. Marianne hops on her motorcycle to find this guy at an old abandoned resort facility built back when Poland was a communist republic. Apparently, this place was a happening spot back in the day, but like most things built in, for, by, or around the general vicinity of communism, led to a terrible tragedy and mass loss of life. No one really knows what happened here thanks to a government cover-up, and as you start to explore, you get the feeling that Marianne's mystery caller and this place's sordid history might be two sides of the same coin. The Medium certainly doesn't do anything wildly new or different with its story, but it's compelling and, at least to me, infinitely interesting. It dabbles in all kinds of cool elements. You've got the mystery surrounding a whole lot of dead people that a communist-era government swept under the rug, supernatural elements like ghosts and echoes of suffering left behind, and then there's Marianne herself, a character that I found relatable and endearing right from the start. She's not a wild card or some loud example of a stereotype you typically see in lazy story writing. She's sort of quiet, introspective, and strikes a nice balance between being emotionally affected by what she's going through, but not overwhelmed by it all. After all, she's seen through to the other side of reality, and that gives her a very interesting perspective on things. Now, I've yet to fully complete the Medium story, but I did do a little cursory review hunting, and it seems like people tend to go either way on this one. Some people enjoy the story, but I've seen a lot who find it boring. Now, of course, this is going to be the most subjective part of any critique, but I found this to be a surprisingly engrossing story. It hit a lot of my buttons, I guess. I love a nice spooky tale concerning ghosts and the supernatural, and I really like strong characters that have a good combination of blind resolve and cynicism. See Heather Mason. Then, of course, there's the looming mystery of what the hell went down in this resort. The game does a great job of stringing you along and only revealing just enough to partially answer 2 questions while posing an additional 3. Honestly, I give this one a massive thumbs up based just on the story it tells, but that's not going to mean very much if you don't like what I'm about to say next. The Medium may not be a walking simulator, but it's enough like one that I could forgive you for thinking it was. Now, there are fail states and genuine elements that'll have you engaging with the game in a more mechanical sense than just moving around, but it's only just barely deeper than that. And cards on the table, I've never really minded a good walking simulator myself. Ever since the PS1 era, when I first started noticing game developers toying with more cinematic elements, I've been fine with the game taking a very linear, storytelling-focused approach. And that's exactly what you're going to get here. In fact, I'd say more than a walking simulator, the medium shares most of its DNA with point-and-click adventure games. You just have full control over your character here instead of using a cursor to move them around. Each area of the game will have you looking around for some kind of contrived way forward, and almost always that will require the solving of some kind of rudimentary puzzle. Of course, the solutions to those puzzles will vary, but they will rarely ever need you to go more than 2 or 3 rooms down before you picked up what you need. Mostly, I found these head scratchers to be at best intuitive and at worst sort of insultingly easy, which isn't the worst thing in the world. Even though I actually get a pretty big kick out of puzzles and video games, I walk that fine line between enjoying it when they're challenging, but hating it when they stump me and I've got to halt all forward progress so I can spend the next 20 minutes arranging tarot cards on a door. Now, you do get a step up in complexity when you're allowed to start crossing over into the other world willingly, but even then, I doubt very much anyone watching with the ability to read will find a lot here that'll challenge you for more than a minute or two. And speaking of that, the medium has this really cool mechanic where you can control Marianne in both our world and the other world simultaneously. Both sides often have some element you're going to want to look out for, and this felt like a really cool idea. Maybe it doesn't get used to its full potential here, but it definitely spices things up when the game starts to drag a bit. And I'll be honest with you, that drag comes from the fact that there is no real combat in the medium to speak of. Marianne does have some assorted spirit powers she can call upon when she's absorbed energy, but instead of using this strategically, it's more often than not going to be treated like a puzzle, with you manipulating Marianne in both worlds in order to make some kind of a change that'll let her access that energy well. And I'm sure some of you guys know how I feel about non-combat horror games. Now, they definitely have their place, but that place is certainly not within the survival horror genre, which leads me right to the argument at the start of this section. This game is in no way, shape, or form survival horror, and that is just flat out not up for debate. I don't care what online rag you write video game reviews for. It includes absolutely no elements past exploration and puzzle solving that could be seen in something like Silent Hill or Resident Evil, and even those two elements are so light they almost don't count. To be fair to Bloober Team though, it doesn't even seem like they're the ones who said it's survival horror, or at the very least they haven't said it anywhere I can find. From what I can tell, it seems to be online reviewers perpetuating this myth, which I guess is par for the course in this industry. Like I said before, this is a narrative-driven adventure game, pure and simple. But I can understand making that mistake. After all, Resident Evil was spawned from Alone in the Dark, which was at its core an adventure game. You know, it seems like a bit of a travesty to me that modern gamers are so far removed from really awesome genres like the point-and-click adventure that when they get faced with one, they immediately have to say it's the most modern point of reference they can think of, which is the walking simulator. Anyways, getting back on the I can see why people would make that mistake topic, there are a lot of storytelling and surface-level elements that were clearly borrowed from games like Silent Hill here. I mean, we do have a literal otherworld that Marianne is violently forced into at certain moments, and the rundown, dilapidated environment she's in certainly would fit in near Toluca Lake. And sure, as a fan of the genre, it is nice seeing these familiar pieces on the board again, but they're just not enough to justify the survival horror term populating so many online reviews of this game. On the plus side though, this is one hell of a looker. I mean, truly, it's hard to put into words how incredible this thing looks on a native 4K panel. Some areas in the game are bordering so hard on photorealism I genuinely assume the backgrounds were pre-rendered at one point. That being said, this amazing fidelity does come at a cost. Not only is the game hard capped at just 60 frames per second, but even with the GTX 3080 Ti and Ryzen 9 3900, an empty room can see the frame rate drop to around 40 FPS, and that is present even when dropping down to medium settings. And I'm going to go ahead and drop a hot take here. Even though your game is incredible to look at, I mean just jaw-dropping, maybe if it can't maintain 60 frames per second on medium settings with ray tracing disabled, all while running on one of the absolute most powerful consumer-grade GPUs on the market, you might have fucked up somewhere. But to be totally fair, this is not meant to be a graphical analysis, just an airing of grievances. The long story I'm looking to shorten here goes like this. No, the medium is not a survival horror game. It does share some cosmetic elements that you could argue comes from titles that belong to that genre, but it's not an RE clone. So why is it here on the list? Which I think might be the third time I've asked this question. Well, to put things simply, I started playing this game for the video, decided it wasn't right for the list, but got so wrapped up in it that I just kept going for hours and hours. So I need to both justify wasting time that could have been spent playing games that actually fit in with the thesis statement here, and recommend you guys check out a title that I think is genuinely amazing. I was truly smitten with the medium, and I get that it might not be for everyone, but if you watched this section and saw something you think you might get into, I'd really suggest checking it out. The story really worked its way under my skin, and the horror elements are pretty damn well done, but I promise from now on it'll be only games that fit the RE clone mold. Or not, I do most of this by the seat of my pants, but I swear I will make a genuine effort this time.
What the hell are you, Neva?
And now we're really getting into the juicy stuff. Conscript has been in development for a while now, and believe you me, I've been following that process like a hawk. Much like Signalis, this is a top-down attempt at recreating that Resident Evil magic, and also like Signalis, we've only got a demo to give us a taste of what we can expect. Amazingly, this thing's being put together by a single guy in Australia, and fun note, the soundtrack was made by the same guy who does all the music for my channel. Pretty damn cool having buds with both talent and good taste in video games. Alright, so right off the bat, I think you guys can tell this one is taking a bit of a different stab at the genre. This game takes place during the First World War, and you play as a French soldier trying to find his brother in a trench overrun with Germans. Things start out pretty bleak with our main character's unit already being thinned out pretty hard, and after a massive push by the enemy, we end up as one of the few surviving soldiers stuck inside the trench. And this took a while to dawn on me, but unlike, well, any other game I can think of in the survival horror genre, there are no supernatural or bioorganic threats here. No zombies or curses, no monsters, well, at least not in the traditional sense. No, instead of fantasy being used to create an air of horror, Conscript just puts you in an already terrifying situation and lets that do all the work. It's one that most would argue is the worst thing a person can go through, and I thought that was a really awesome way to approach such an old genre while still making sure to pay tribute to the foundations it was built on. The game has a thick and incredibly oppressive atmosphere despite the fact that it doesn't use any fantasy elements to add to the horror, and it keeps you just as on edge as any other games in its class. Oh, and speaking of games in its class, this is one hell of a true survival horror title as far as gameplay is concerned. Your enemies can really kick your ass in no time, and healing items are not easy to get a hold of. Combat requires you to hold a shoulder button and press the other to swing or shoot, but you can squeeze a little more damage and accuracy out of the attack by letting your reticle shrink before you let loose. And trust me, this is something you're going to want to get the hang of real early on. Combat in Conscript, while seemingly simple, can be incredibly punishing. At first I was getting killed a lot because these bad guys aren't exactly the shambling corpses I'm used to in the genre. They can run and will hunt you down if they see you. I started getting really good at firing my weapon, chambering another round, and using the stamina draining dodge move to get a little distance before finishing the job. If you've played these type of games before, you'll know spacing has always been important, but here it's on a whole new level, and I'll be honest, at first I was ready to criticize the game about this, but I ended up really liking it after I started to wrap my head around how it works. Taking advantage of the iframes when you dodge, and making sure you've loaded another round before you try to fire again in the heat of battle, it's all going to come to you eventually, but it can be a lot at first. Outside of combat, you'll be doing a lot of familiar tasks like picking up keys, clearing barricades, and overall just trying to unlock more of this nasty-ass environment to explore. I can't remember coming across any puzzles in the demo, but I've got to assume he's going to put some in the final release, or at least I'm hoping that's the case because I'd love to see what he comes up with. And speaking of demos, this thing's probably only going to take you an hour or so to clear, so I may not be able to say too much more about how it plays, but I can say this. If the finished product is able to keep up this kind of pace, we've got an absolute classic on our hands. And to be totally honest with you, a lot of my love for this game comes from its interesting presentation. Not only is this one hell of a setting for a survival horror game, I mean, honestly, how did it take this long for someone to put World War I and Resident Evil together? But the narrow bit depth, low resolution pixel art, and color banding really sells the look. I mean, think about it. This is an old genre that, for good reason, never sees modernization, so it makes sense that a game that belongs in it would look appropriately old. All of the atrocities around you are traumatizing as it is, especially since you know they have real-life analogs, but the dirt and grit that comes from the low resolution just puts a gross bow on the whole package. You know, I'm starting to think I'm becoming a strictly 2D survival horror fan at this point. Okay, so I am overly excited for this game, but there are a few gripes that come to mind. At one point, I saved my game with my health on danger, and after dying and reloading that save, I noticed that it was at fine again, which I thought was weird but continued on anyways. Well, after that, I kept dying really easily, like in 1 or 2 hits, and I thought these enemies were just elites or something, but it turns out the game was just telling me I was at fine when in reality I needed to use a healing item. I also had a German soldier glide at me aggressively, which was pretty damn funny, but my biggest problem is one I think would be easily fixed. I've always been the type of guy who likes to turn off the heads-up display whenever possible, especially in a game like this where immersion is key, but in this game, I think the developer may have taken that idea a little too far. Whenever the HUD's off, you can no longer see what items you're picking up, and when swapping weapons using the D-pad as hotkeys, you have no idea what weapon you've changed to because they aren't visible on your character model until you take aim. If I had one humble request, it would be to strike a middle ground here. When the HUD is turned off, maybe get rid of the visible health and stamina meters, which are my biggest problem, but keep the short prompts that show what item you've just picked up and the icons that briefly let you know what weapon you've switched to and its available ammo. Now, this is a demo, and I'm sure we can expect more polish from the final release of the game, but even if that's not the case, we are still dealing with one hell of a good time here. I am eagerly awaiting Conscript's release, and if you're into classic survival horror done right, you should be too. It puts a really refreshing spin on a genre that I love, which is really saying a lot in the context of the unique titles included in this video, and it does it all while looking just beautiful. Well, I guess more accurately dark and desolate, but same thing, right? Song of Horror sort of came out of nowhere for me. I think the first time I really noticed it existed was in an Amazon ad banner. Well, I did a little research and saw a lot of people talking about old school survival horror, which to be fair more often than not means the opposite, but I decided to take a leap of faith and grab it on Steam. And I'll tell you this right off the bat, Song of Horror is genuinely scary. Now, if you're like me, you've seen a lot of these kind of games come and go, and that tends to desensitize you to the kind of tricks a horror title can pull to get under your skin. Well, that was my thought process anyways, and I was there thinking nothing could scare me out of my seat anymore, but that actually happened a few times while playing this game.
Let's see that in an instant replay.
As for the survival horror label given by online reviewers, we'll get into that in a sec, but let's just say this might be one of the very few times where an opinion in games media was actually close to the mark. Song of Horror starts out with you taking control of some guy named Daniel. Our boy Dan just got off of work and is looking to watch some late 90s TV. But as luck would have it, he gets a call from his boss asking him to look in on a writer whose manuscript is due soon. Apparently no one can get in touch with the guy, and he's a prolific writer, so they want to make sure he hasn't disappeared. Daniel's not exactly thrilled at the notion of driving out to the middle of nowhere on a Friday night, but he's a recovering alkie and is looking to climb the corporate ladder, so he begrudgingly agrees. Once Daniel gets to the house, he finds the door open and some music box belting out tunes from somewhere in the place. After a quick search, he's unable to find a living soul, but does come across a door that looks like it shouldn't be there. As soon as he walks inside of it, the door immediately closes, which is a trope in and of itself, and that would be bad enough, but the door itself actually disappears as well, leaving behind a sort of dark stain where it used to be. Daniel stumbles around in the dark and recounts that he's been there for days, just hallucinating in the nothingness, and he's terrified at the idea that maybe the things he's seen and heard down there aren't exactly products of his imagination. Flash forward to Monday, and his boss is understandably worried, so Dan's ex-wife, who left him back when he was a drunk, decides to see what the hell's going on over there, and this is when things get very interesting. Song of Horror isn't exactly your average survival horror game. It takes an almost roguelike approach to how it's laid out. You can pick from a pretty wide selection of characters to play the game as, each one having different stats, and after playing a bit as Dan's wife, I started to think those stats were just set dressing, but it didn't take very long for me to find out exactly how important they really are. Now, when the game first started off, I sort of figured that each character might have different chapters and maybe each one would help put the full story together, but that little theory turned out to be way off. In this game, you don't exactly have a restart from your last save sort of option on death. If a character dies, you've got to choose another one and pick up where you left off. Now, when I said roguelike, I assume you immediately thought about randomly generated game content, and that is a slight factor here, but not in the way you might think. The house you're exploring remains the same no matter who you're playing as, but the scares and unique events that take place are a combination of being character-specific and randomized. On my first playthrough, I lost Sophie to a random room I barged into a little too fast, and I figured since I'd grown fond of her, I'd just restart and play as her again instead of picking a new character. Well, on that new run, I noticed events that never occurred before, and that made things way more unnerving. Usually, permadeath is a tough sell outside of strategy RPGs, and even then you really gotta approach it right, but I really enjoyed how much stress this added to the game. In any survival horror game, a death might at worst mean a loss of progress. If it's been an hour since your last save, the last thing you want to do is have to retrace those steps thanks to a stray zombie bite, but in Song of Horror, the longer you play, the more you get attached to your character. These guys talk a lot during the game, developing a bit of a personality. They make quips about the situation to themselves, and their dialogue is different when examining elements in the environment. Some of them a little more on the nose than others. I thought that was a great touch. It really added a bit of finality to death that had me dreading it even more than I normally do in these kind of games, and I guess since we've covered the fact that you can die, we should probably talk about how to avoid that. And in my opinion, this is where we start to stray a bit from survival horror. Song of Horror doesn't seem to have any combat in it, or at least none that I've found playing up to about the halfway point. Instead, you can only really run or hide from threats in the game, and if you know me, you know I always say that the genre needs to have combat as an option. Of course, part of playing these games well is deciding when, where, or if at all you want to engage with it, but it's gotta be there. So maybe we take a few points off there, but trust me, Song of Horror gets them back real quick in how true it stays to every other pillar of the genre. On top of that, the permadeath mechanic adds so much tension to actually succumbing to the Lovecraftian horror in this house that I really couldn't imagine it working any other way. As you explore the old place, you'll come across adventure game style puzzles that'll need you to apply the right MacGuffin to fix or look around and observe some element of the environment to decipher the odd combination lock. It feels very authentic to that familiar Resident Evil design, but also stays intuitive, so when you come across a problem and then its solution half an hour later, it's really easy to remember, oh yeah, these tongs might help me get whatever's at the bottom of this clogged ass toilet. On that note though, maybe don't go reaching into every bathroom item you come across. Trust me on that one.
Freezing. Thank God. I think it's over now.
Song of Horror was a big surprise for me. At its start, it's deceptively simple. It plays like your average survival horror game, but the longer it goes on, the more deep and complex its systems become. It puts a very welcome spin on a style I'm already in love with and makes for one hell of a unique gameplay experience. It does, however, suffer from a few problems you should probably be aware of. And we're going to break with tradition here and start with its absolute worst issue, the fact that the game has an incredibly slow start. The first few minutes of the game are spent looking around Daniel's apartment for no reason, and after that, unless you know exactly where to go, you can spend a lot of time at the Husher house trying to figure out where it's leading you. And even after you pick up the game proper, there's a slow build before you catch wind of anything with malintent being in the house with you. Now, on one end, yes, this does absolutely build tension, but I imagine there are a few people who didn't make it to the parts of the game that are so damn enjoyable. So coming into this one, expect it to have a bit of a slow burn, but I promise you it's worth waiting out. And I guess this next one is sort of a compliment wrapped in a complaint. It is really easy to die in this game. My first death came from just running into the wrong room. See, early on it introduced a mechanic where you can put your ear to the door before walking in a room and make sure the coast is clear, and that's really cool, especially in a game with no offensive options. But the problem is, I spent a full hour listening to doors before walking into them and never came across one that had anything in it, so I sort of stopped after a while and never had any issues, so imagine my surprise when I do exactly what I've been doing this whole time and accidentally walk in on this terrifying sight. Like I said, this is a bit of a compliment because that first death was traumatizing enough to ensure I was listening to every damn door I came across, but past that, some of the quick time event adjacent moments where you need to stay calm or keep an evil presence out of a room can be pretty easy to fail. My second death came when I was trying to keep a door closed and thought I was doing everything right but ended up dying anyways, which I guess is where the strength stat would have come in handy. So I guess the point here is that this is a really challenging game, but again, this does help add to the tension and scare factor, so I guess take that one with a grain of salt. And last up is the game's visuals. Much like its slow burn start, Song of Horror does not begin with its best foot forward presentation-wise. This thing really excels at rendering a beautifully scary environment shrouded in inky darkness, but it's not so great when the lights are on. And sadly, the entire beginning of the game is spent looking at assets that are a little underwhelming in full daylight. Like I said, the game's at its absolute best when you can barely see, and that's not a dig at it or anything. When the lights go out, it is an absolute sight to behold, but when things are well lit and up close, you can see some animations and 3D model work that looks significantly less impressive. Once it gets dark enough to get your flashlight out though, expect to be wowed by how great everything looks. And despite all those small gripes, this was an incredibly enjoyable time. I went in not knowing what to expect, and just when I figured I had something generic on my hands, the game went and pulled the rug out from under me in the most satisfying way possible. The antagonist, for lack of a better word, being some ethereal haunting type of deal, really makes this game stand out in the genre and sort of helps explain why I can't just pick up the rifles and swords scattered around this house and go to town on it. The fact that this isn't some bloodthirsty zombie or crazed psycho killer, but instead a dark force from beyond the realm of human comprehension makes for an insanely effective horror atmosphere. I've got no issues admitting I jumped at no less than 3 parts of the short time I spent with this game. Now, full disclosure, I haven't beaten the game yet, so for all I know it might go to shit past the halfway point or something I've already said might be proven wrong, but I don't really think that's something you should worry about. Song of Horror is just flat out awesome, and I would totally recommend it to anyone looking to get that typical RE experience, but with a few twists as significant as they are enjoyable. If you want the real effect though, make sure to play it in the dark, have some good headphones on, and maybe keep a few pairs of spare pants within arm's reach. Lost in Vivo has been a darling of the indie horror scene since its release in 2018, and as a guy who spends way too much damn time on YouTube, I've seen plenty of my favorite content creators cover it. But based on those passing glances, I sort of wrote the game off. I saw the perspective and heard people compare it to Silent Hill, which in my book is almost always a recipe for disappointment, so I sort of let this one pass me by. Well, fast forward 4 years and an older, way fatter version of me is working on a video covering games just like this, and I finally decided to see what all the fuss was about. The game starts off with a therapist of some kind talking to their client, recommending they undergo in vivo exposure therapy, a method that'll have people being introduced to the things they have unhealthy fears of, and I guess that makes perfect sense because this game sort of aims to provide that same service. Apparently, this thing's supposed to have a quasi-claustrophobic effect on the player, to the point where the developer allows you to change the very narrow FOV, but recommends that you don't since it might ruin the intended effects. So I decided to go against my better judgment and leave it at stock and start the game up. At the beginning, our main character, who to my knowledge is never actually named, is walking their cute dog when a sudden storm hits and somehow his little cutie gets caught up in a storm drain. So our protagonist, being of the Adam Sandler school of missing pets, jumps into the unknown to
find that fucking door!
As soon as we get down there, we can whistle to find our pooch, and at one point we finally come face to snout with the little guy, but he's dragged away deeper into the abyss, and I'll be damned if I'm gonna let a single knife-wielding hobo keep me off the trail of a good boy. So away we go. As the game progresses, the environment becomes more twisted and warped. At the start, we're dealing with what I would call a pretty standard sewer system, but we end up making our way through an old 1920s looking subway tunnel, complete with flesh-eating subway trains because why the hell not? Then we come across some kind of weird research lab that takes animal testing a bit too far, and an endless dungeon type of area that gives zero shits about the laws of physics. Really though, I can't say much else about the story because there isn't much of it around to talk about, and I think that's by design. The developer really only gives you enough to get your ass in gear looking for that dog, and to be honest, anything past that is just a bonus in my opinion. Now, I'm sure there are wikis out there that will have combed through every single journal entry you come across and pieced them all together using clues found in the game's code or something, but for a first-time player, there is effectively no story. It seems to me the entire game might just be a sick person rationalizing what they're going through with their in vivo therapy, or maybe just some kind of interactive allegory for that procedure, but either way, I'd say come into this one expecting to do a bit of legwork on the story side of things, and you might be pleasantly surprised. On the gameplay front, I will admit I had this game all wrong. Like I said before, I had already formed my own dumb bias against the thing and had just assumed I wouldn't like it. Now, I did watch a few reviews over the years, but I either just glanced up at them while doing something else or blocked out parts of those videos because I got the impression this was a really linear game. I don't know, maybe it's the visuals of the sewer tunnels that did it to me, but for one reason or another, I just assumed this couldn't fall into the realm of RE clone from a sheer gameplay perspective, but since it's on this video, I'm sure you've worked out I was wrong. Lost in Vivo contains most of the traits you'd want out of a survival horror game. You explore large, twisting environments, trying to find items that'll help unlock more areas to progress forward, engaging in tough combat that has you wagering limited resources on the decision to run or fight. There's a lot of backtracking through the game world, which leads you to becoming really familiar with your surroundings, and puzzles that'll require you to think a little outside the box. I was sort of taken back when I had to run consecutive miles in the first real gameplay area to shut down a few breaker boxes so that I could reset an electrical system and hitch a ride out of there. I guess I just wasn't expecting gameplay that actually stayed true to the genre, and because it was such a surprise, I think I enjoyed In Vivo all the more. Which is really cool because at first the game doesn't do much to curb that initial assumption. It starts in a very linear fashion with you just navigating winding sewer tunnels looking for the one and only way forward, but then everything widens out after you hit the subway station, and while there is some variation, it mostly sticks to that model. It seems like each area has its own theme to it, but I really liked all of them. One of my favorites being the above mentioned section where I had to turn off power in like 3 or 4 spots of this big ass station. In doing so, I would be blacking out entire sections of the station, and in the dark, these floating ghost things would spawn. These things seem to be infinite, but my resources definitely are not, so in moving the game forward, I was sort of forced to turn the lights out and leave myself susceptible to the dangers therein, which as I'm writing this, I'm realizing really keeps with the whole in vivo experimentation thing. In a different but similar situation, in the latter half of the game, I came across a very different kind of puzzle. I was trapped in an endless hallway, but the puzzle wasn't finding the right route to progress, because you can move forward no matter which side you take, but one of them is going to pit you against a giant fetus thing that might be impossible to kill. Either that or I just suck at the game. Oh, and just a tip so you don't end up having to alt-tab into a guide after spending 10 or 15 minutes in this room, maybe don't make any assumptions about these bars here, specifically in regards to their, let's say, corporeality. What I really appreciated about the game, though, was not its gameplay, fun as it was, but instead the fact that it was constantly messing with me. Lost in Vivo definitely skews more towards the psychological horror side of the survival horror spectrum, and obviously takes a lot of hints from Silent Hill. Well, just like SH, Vivo likes to make sure you stay very uncomfortable. At one point, I was on my last lockpick and it seemingly randomly broke while trying to pick the only lock in between me and the next area. So in frustration, I hit the door with a sledgehammer and turned around to maybe find some more lockpicks. But I didn't make it more than a few steps before I heard the odd sound of the thing just creaking open on its own. Similarly, I would die to a powerful enemy and reload a save to find the enemy just not there anymore, but instead the previously safe areas were now filled with these weird mirror guys that took a good chunk of damage to take down. There was even a section where I went to examine a corpse, but the game put him in my inventory and threw me a Unity engine error message, which I'm like 75% sure was just the game screwing with me. I felt like it did that off and on throughout the entire experience, and it really helped the creep factor a lot. Every time I would feel like I knew what was up and started to fall into a routine, the game would step in to let me know I was not in control of what happens here. It was. At one point, I unlocked some kind of a different game, which was fun and kinda cool, but imagine my surprise when I went to boot up Lost in Vivo but was met with a totally different title screen for a different game, one that you actually have to quit out of before you can play the game you originally meant to play. Keeping with the comparisons to Silent Hill, this game has a soundtrack that is most definitely inspired by Akira Yamaoka's work. Hell, not just the soundtrack, but every aspect of the sound design. Moments that needed to be more contemplative had no music whatsoever aside from some ambient environmental sounds, and when there was music, it was very SH adjacent. There's a lot of atonal industrial sounds stacked on top of each other until some kind of a strange discordant melody is achieved. It's incredibly abrasive, but it fits the feel of the game really well. On startup, the game recommends you put on a pair of headphones, and I want to second that recommendation real hard. With a good pair of headphones on, every echoing drip of water and static broadcasting radio is really going to put you into the game's world. And when navigating the sewer tunnels, whistling for your dog, there's defined enough stereo separation you'll actually be able to map the right route just by ear. Once again, I am very glad to have been proven wrong about a game. Lost in Vivo is incredibly fun and feels like a perfect follow-up to the kind of mind-bending experience that Silent Hill often dabbles in. It plays like a traditional survival horror game, but includes mechanics and content that puts it firmly more in the psychological camp. But no matter what arbitrary genre label you put on it, the fact remains that it's just an amazingly fun video game that keeps you feeling scared as hell. And honestly, if you're even slightly interested in the subject matter of this video, that's probably something you're looking for. I've had Heaven Dust sitting in my Steam library so damn long I can't even remember when I originally bought it. I remember the reason I picked it up was based solely on the trailer making it look like some kind of a top-down RE game, and after finally playing it, well, that's precisely what it is. The story concerns a very familiar setup with a pharmaceutical company finding a virus or something in New Guinea. After doing a bit of research there, it's discovered this stuff called Heaven Dust is able to stimulate cell regeneration, but with the tricky side effect of killing the subject and bringing them back as a bloodthirsty zombie. So eventually the obvious takes place and the facility is overrun by the living dead, and the company decides the one thing they messed up on was not having the research take place on their doorstep. So a lab is set up in the US, and wouldn't you just know it, an outbreak occurs and the whole place sees a massive uptick in the zombie population. You play as some guy who works in the research lab, or actually, now that I think about it, I'm not really sure. I can't remember being told exactly who my character is or why they're there, but regardless, our protagonist saw things getting hairy and locked himself in a storage closet till things started to calm down, and that's where we come in. From the very start, the game sets you up to pay attention to your environment and approach issues with a little more tact than your average gunfight. Once we're out of the storage room, we've got a big facility to explore, and you just know that's going to require our good friends backtracking, puzzle solving, and resource management. As for the story, there isn't much that isn't delivered through journal entries, and most of that is just letting us in on individual experiences before and just after the virus leaked. There is a cool plot thread having to do with a researcher dealing with someone on the outside looking to expose this company for their shady tactics and the people they've killed in the name of covering up this stuff's existence, but at the time of writing the script I haven't finished the game, so I'm not exactly sure where that's headed. Regardless though, a deep and enthralling narrative isn't exactly required here. For these kind of games, I typically just want some reason for me being there and a good reason I'd want to leave, and I'd say Heaven Dust does a good enough job at that. On the plus side though, those individual accounts I was talking about earlier do a great job of fleshing out the world we're in. From what I can tell, I'm more than halfway through the game, and there hasn't been any story that wasn't delivered via text or some journal entry, so I guess keep that in mind if you're looking to play this thing. But in my opinion, this is far from a negative. And that's because this game puts some really fun twist on the kind of experience you're expecting from an RE clone. As you can see, the view is top down, and like I've said maybe 3 times in this video already, this perspective lends itself to survival horror a lot better than you might think. Combat's handled exactly like it is in any other game in the genre, with the whole hold a shoulder button to ready your weapon and hit the action button to shoot thing, and enemies can do some serious damage, so spacing and crowd control are massively important. And speaking of which, if you find yourself between 2 zombies, you might as well save yourself a few seconds and just quit to the load screen, because you are guaranteed to die in that encounter. There are a lot of healing items scattered around in the form of the eternally familiar green and red herbs, but you can't really push through enemies, and their attacks are so fast and your hit stun lasts so long that you stand next to no chance of getting out of that situation. Exploration is just spot on for what I want out of an RE clone, with this big ass compound slowly opening up after keys are found and puzzles are solved. This research lab / mansion makes for an awesome spot to set the game in, and we know that because it's not our first time seeing it. I always just wanted to make a little more progress before turning the game off, mostly because I'd like to see what new rooms I might come across and how they would link back up with the rest of the place. And speaking of perfect segues, let's circle back to the puzzles, which, man, I really had fun with. Some of them required me to suss out a numerical combination based on things in the environment, and those were a little tougher to crack, but the ones that had me pushing stuff around or interacting with the backdrops were really fun to solve. A lot of the time, item hunting was pretty intuitive, like finding a section of pipe to help douse a raging fire or getting a virus sample to throw off a lockdown system. It's the kind of design that has you sort of subconsciously knowing exactly where and how an item needs to be used to move forward. I think maybe this and the exploration were my favorite parts of Heaven Dust. I just really enjoyed feeling like a galaxy brain for knowing exactly where I had to go when I came across a specific MacGuffin, even though I hadn't been to that section of the map in what seemed like an hour. Once again, I had initial issues believing something that looked this cutesy could fit into the confines of a survival horror title, but that's exactly what it does. What's really cool though is that's not all that it does. Sharing a similar system to another game on this list, Heaven Dust has downed enemies dropping a type of currency that can be used at these vending machines to exchange for resources or stat buffs. And this whole thing leads into a very interesting mechanic. See, ammo is limited in the traditional sense, meaning the game has a very finite amount of ammo pickups that you can come across, and that means you're going to have to be smart with how you spend it, but it goes a little deeper than that. In some areas, you'll find spent bullet casings that can be collected, and at these vending machines you can buy gunpowder to get some of your bullets back. Now, I'm not exactly sure how that makes any sense, seeing as how the gunpowder is only half of what you're going to need to make a spent casing an actual projectile again, but it's game logic and maybe we shouldn't think about it too much. Anyways, I just thought this was a neat system. You guys know I like my ammo limited, and this does sort of mess with that, but I think it still fits. See, you've got to spend a pretty rare resource to get gunpowder, and you can't always rely on casings just laying around. If you ask me, it's a pretty well-balanced system that, instead of making me feel overpowered or flush with ammunition, just kept my head a few more inches above water in some of the more hairy sections of the game. Of course, we can't avoid the elephant in the room much longer, which is the presentation. This is essentially chibi Resident Evil, and maybe that's a turnoff for some, but come on, just look at this cute little guy shooting at an even cuter zombie. I love it. I think the art style not only fits the lighter mood of Heaven Dust, but is also pleasing to look at. I mean, sure, you're not going to take any of these monsters seriously, with them looking even less realistic than the PS1's blocky attempt at zombie representation, but they don't exactly expect you to, and besides, it's just cool looking. I really liked how I could see into other rooms while walking through hallways, which meant I was better off navigating here without a map, and that's exactly what I did. Now, you can buy a map at the vending machine, but you'll almost always know where you are and where you're going thanks to the non-existent roof over your head. When you or an enemy gets obscured by something in the foreground, you get a nice bright wireframe outline, which is a nice touch and adds a little well-needed flair. Really, my only complaint with the visuals would be the fact that my weapon and inventory are always visible on screen. That kind of takes me out of what little immersion can be had with the visual style. Don't let that fool you though, I have a ton more things to complain about. First up, there are a lot of red flags here letting me know that this project could have used a little more money behind it. There are spelling errors and grammatical mistakes on almost every screen you look at, and when you go outside, you can hear a very familiar ambient sound effects track. Now, I'm not really sure if this sound effect is in the public domain or not, but I'm almost positive that the specific combination of it and the track behind it are Capcom's intellectual property, and call me crazy, I don't think they okayed its use in this game. That being said though, it's clear effort went into the things that really matter, so you won't see the typical buggy gameplay or poorly thought out mechanics that tend to accompany low budget or low experience titles. Except for one area that might not be obvious right off the bat. Heaven Dust requires you to make way too many damn trips to the item box. It feels like half the game's runtime is spent trekking back and forth between save rooms to clear up space, and keep in mind you're talking to a guy who defends Resident Evil Zero's inventory system as not being tedious. Imagine how much time is wasted dropping items in a chest for me to get pissed off here. It feels like even just 2 more inventory slots would help balance this little problem and might get your trips to the save room cut down to a more manageable number. That being said though, this is still a really fun game. Even while constantly heading to and from an item box, I was still enjoying the typical survival horror gameplay, especially because of how much of a juxtaposition it is when compared to the game's presentation. What's really cool is Heaven Dust did well enough to get a sequel made, and I'm hoping I can scrounge together enough titles to squeeze a 3rd volume out of this series because I'd really like to try it out. Either way though, I definitely recommend Heaven Dust for people who want that familiar Resident Evil-like experience but want a few little tweaks made so that it feels fresh and interesting. I mean, let's be honest, a bad translation and poor grammar are basically the written equivalent of RE1's, let's say, unique voice acting, right? Some of you guys already know, I covered Alisa a while ago, and I won't keep you in suspense, I absolutely loved it. This is the other half of the 2 games that ignited my passion to check out modern survival horror titles, and with a look like this, could you really blame me? Essentially, it's just an old PS1 game running upscaled on your computer, which almost guarantees a play from me, but it's not just the old polygons that have me pushing Alisa on everyone I know. There's a very good chance that this plays exactly like what you're looking for out of a survival horror game, but it has a few cool twists as well. Just like Heaven's Dust, killing enemies will net you a currency which can be spent at save points to upgrade your gear. As you play, you'll come across ammo and healing items as usual, but your weapons and dresses will only be found through this mechanic. And while, like I said, you can find items in the environment, you can also buy them if you find yourself getting too low. Now, I've been known to go on rants about how a dead enemy leaving behind resources almost always knocks a game out of the running when it comes to classifying it as a survival horror title, and at first this might seem like a backpedal, but I still think Alisa deserves that badge of honor. Mostly because the enemies here don't just drop the ammo or items you need like in modern RE titles. They drop a resource that is incredibly limited. After all, there are only a finite amount of enemies in the game, meaning this currency just fits further into the limited resource aspect of the genre. It's not the game giving you more items when you're low, but instead it's giving you vouchers for items and letting you decide when and where to exchange them. On top of that, the resources that can be gained in this shop are also limited, so you absolutely can screw up a run in this game. Really, I think the system plays really well with the kind of careful balance that comes with survival horror game design, but I'd say it's even more faithful when it comes to exploration. Story-wise, our girl Alisa here is a member of some kind of elite police force working for the royal family, and she's been sent in to look for a thief who has managed to snatch some kind of important plans. In the process of catching the guy, the two get dragged into some kind of weird place called the Dollhouse, and this is one really interesting location to get lost in. Of course, comparisons to the Spencer Mansion are definitely apt here, but this place has a feel all of its own. Since the game sort of plays fast and loose with reality, there are places in this dollhouse that you definitely won't see in your average domicile, which means the developer could go crazy making fantastical backdrops that manage to walk that thin line between believability and interesting design. Most of the enemies you'll encounter here follow a theme of old-timey marionettes, dolls, and toys, which I think is a welcome breath of fresh air in the genre. And speaking of enemies, combat follows the typical rules of these kind of games, but with a few interesting tweaks. First off, you're only able to carry 2 weapons with you at one time, but you can switch back and forth between them with just the press of a button. And to add to the strategy of survival horror combat, you're unable to reload your guns in your inventory, so everything you do while in combat is going to have to take place in real time. I think these two mechanics play really well off of each other. For example, the shotgun takes forever to reload, so maybe instead of attempting to get some space for that long wait, you switch to your sidearm and see if you can finish the fight that way. There's also a nice little mechanic that has you being able to buy new dresses for Alisa, and on top of giving you something nice to look at while you run around and solve puzzles, these threads will also buff certain stats like defense or reload speed. The music in this game sort of sounds like something you'd hear out of an early 90s PC game with lots of MIDI synth. There's also a lot of music box sounding cues, which fits the surroundings really well. It's not the best soundtrack I've ever heard in a survival horror game, but it keeps the mood feeling right, which is nice. Like I said before, I already covered Alisa in full here on the channel, so instead of repeating all that, I'll just link to it in the description and in the little card that, if I did my job correctly, should be showing up in the right-hand corner of the screen right about now. The TLDR version of it, though, is basically this. Alisa is a really fun RE clone that not only looks the part, but plays it as well. If you're watching this video trying to get ideas for new games in the genre to try out, this one should be near the top of the list. It plays like an old game from the 90s, and as you know here on this channel, that's one of the best compliments I can give. And capping off what should rightly be called the sprite-based RE clone video, we've got Lamentum, one of the many titles you guys let me know about in the last volume of this little experiment. Now personally, I wasn't too thrilled to start this bad boy up because its presentation gives me a real RPG Maker non-combat horror kind of vibe, but it did not take very long for me to realize that is definitely not correct. And I'll tell you right now, this is one hell of a survival horror title, but before we get into why that is, let's talk about the story. Lamentum starts out with a nice happy memory, which should immediately raise a few red flags that things are about to get real depressing, and, well, they do. Victor here is head over heels for his wife, but not long into their marriage, she's stricken with some unknown illness. This being the mid-19th century, there isn't much in the way of medical care that doesn't involve leeches or cutting limbs off, so there doesn't seem to be much that could be done here. In his desperation, Victor contacts a man that he's heard of who possesses lost knowledge and has reportedly worked miracles in the past. This mysterious genius responds to the letter, and the couple head on their way to the guy's estate. But they're not in the place for more than a few minutes when things start immediately getting weird. Victor's wife starts acting strange and runs off. While in pursuit, Victor stumbles across, well, himself, but injured and bleeding, the sight causing him to collapse, and when he regains consciousness, it seems like a whole lot of time has passed, and the manor now looks like a hellish version of itself. There's a letter on the nightstand from the person who bandaged his wounds, warning him to stay in his room, but our boy Victor isn't about to let a little blood loss keep him from finding his girl. As we explore the mansion, we come across others unlucky enough to be caught up in this hell on earth, and from the stories they tell, we were here a lot longer than the few minutes we remember. It seems like the guy who runs this show had some sort of a cult set up here, and each one of the people in the house had some kind of serious issue they were looking to solve, just like Victor. Admittedly, I haven't gotten more than halfway through this one, so I'm not really sure how everything fits together in the end, but I really like what I've seen so far. This may not be the first time these elements have ever come together in a story before, but I really like Lamentum's tale. I think the combination of the period it's set in and the Silent Hill-like otherworld everyone seems to be stuck in makes for an awesome atmosphere. And the gameplay is just as interesting. The expected exploration, item hunting, and puzzle solving are all here, and if you're a fan of the genre, expect to hit the ground running with this one. It's a very familiar setup and everything fits together perfectly like you'd want. The manor being a demonic, derelict version of itself makes for an awesome incentive to see more of it, and at points our guy Victor will be transported to an even scarier, organic looking place where some mysterious figure tries to communicate with him. And I mention that because I think the mystery of it all does a lot of the heavy lifting here. While I do love survival horror gameplay, I think having a narrative that helps enforce and incentivize that gameplay really completes the experience. I flat out just wanted to know more about what happened here, and I wanted to see more of the environment, which had me stoked to move forward. Plus, it helps that I'm already a huge fan of backtracking across a big-ass environment filled with more locked doors than on-screen pixels. Being a 2D sprite-based game that operates more on the X-axis than the Y, combat takes a pretty interesting turn here. Like any of the other games we've covered so far, a shoulder button will ready your weapon and another one will attack, and there's also a nifty dodge roll that'll help you stay alive. Balancing that is a stamina meter that'll have you stopping dead in your tracks to catch your breath if you deplete it, so you're going to want to be real careful about how much you run when enemies are around because you're going to want to conserve that stamina for dodging. Honestly though, once you wrap your head around how combat actually works, it's not too hard to get in an attack or two, run away, and charge another while the enemy comes at you. I found hitboxes a little hard to get the hang of though, and it seemed like shooting at enemies had a 50-50 chance of missing because they were always just a hair below or above the plane I was occupying, an issue fans of beat-em-ups will know all too well. That aside though, I found combat to be really fun, especially when I got my hands on a slower but more powerful weapon. The inventory here is limited, just like I like them, and I'm happy to say it does not suffer from that heaven dust problem of needing to constantly make trips to the item chest. From what I can tell, there are less necessary collectible items to be found all over the place that seem to affect what ending you get, and that's pretty cool, I guess. After capturing my footage, I checked out a few reviews for the game and found out that some scenes require certain conditions to be met for you to see them, making for a cool bit of replay value. Personally, I was really interested in the other inhabitants of the house and what brought them there, so being able to hear more from them was a good motivator. One thing I really have to praise though are the game's puzzles. They feel like a good combination of that Silent Hill style, that being finding clues and notes and journal entries that can be used to solve some cipher, and your more common adventure game method, which will have you scouting out items in the environment and using them at the right roadblock. There also seems to be a bit of decision making going on because early on I found a rope that I could give to some guy that I had met previously, but I found out I could also keep it for myself for a future issue. There's really a lot going on here, it's pretty impressive. Lamentum may be the last game I played for this video, but I think it's also the one I most want to spend time with once the video is finished. It feels like I'm just scratching the tip of the iceberg as far as gameplay goes, and the mystery and setting have me real damn interested in unraveling all of this. I also gotta admit I'm a bit of a sucker for its presentation. Now, we've covered other pixel-based games in the video so far, but this one takes a comparatively lower res approach to the style, and at first I thought it wouldn't work so well in conveying the horror that the game's trying to bring across, but it most definitely gets that job done. The entire game just looks amazing, but I think it's at its best when showing the decrepit and demolished state of the manor. I don't know, there's just something about pixel art horror games that works for me. Maybe it's because I have to use my imagination to fill in a lot of blanks left behind by the low resolution, but either way, consider me a fan. The game's soundtrack is more than appropriate, making sure you feel creeped out at all times, which is exactly what a good survival horror game soundtrack should be doing. Oh, and big props to the sound effects too. Instead of using a chiptune sort of sound, which you would expect with how the game looks, they went with really high fidelity, detailed sound work, and while there is a bit of a disconnect between it and the visuals, it comes across really effectively. Honestly, this whole game is just really impressive. I didn't know anything about Lamentum going into this except for the fact that a lot of you guys liked it, and now that I've had some time with it, I can safely say I know why. It has a really interesting atmosphere, and it hits me in the same kind of way that Lovecraft's writing does. There's just something about media set far into the past that lets me suspend my disbelief a little easier as far as horror is concerned. I think maybe it's because we knew so little about the world back then, it's just easier to put yourself into a mindset that anything could happen. A modern city besieged by demons? Sure, that's fun, but not as effective as a small 19th century mansion in the middle of nowhere overrun with unnatural horrors from beyond the realm of human comprehension. It may also help that for the last 2.5 decades of my life, I've been listening to death metal and black metal, so basically anything concerning summoning demons and gore-covered interior design is always going to get my attention. Regardless of what kind of music you listen to though, Lamentum is well worth checking out. On its face, you may think it'd be hard for it to creep you out, but trust me when I say it is more than capable of doing just that. If you ever found yourself watching Bram Stoker's Dracula and thinking, well, I wonder what this would be like if it was a survival horror game, well, now you've got your answer. Damn, I was kind of joking about that, but can you imagine how good that would be? Fuck, indie devs, get on that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for hanging out with me while I checked out a bunch of games I should have been playing for a long time now. Once again, if you know any other modern RE clones I should be trying out, feel free to drop them in the comments. Trust me, nothing will please me more than being able to get another one of these videos out. But speaking of which, I have to wrap this one up because, well, I'm not too sure what I'm going to cover next. Regardless of what that ends up being though, here's hoping I see all of you there. But until then, as usual, I'm Jared.
Jen, what are you doing?
I swallowed my cure-dent.
And this is Avalanche Reviews. Well, hey there friends, thank you very much for making it to the end of this long ass video. I didn't really write anything in my script for this end section, but I feel like you guys know the deal by now. I've got a Patreon, I have channel memberships, and I like reading your comments, so please do one of those things maybe. Alright guys, peace out, have a good one, I love you. Mwah.